Walk into any old transport café and ask the drivers about the lorries they grew up with. The names they say will stop you in your tracks. ERF Foden, Scammell, Bedford. Names that once filled every motorway, every dockyard, every building site in Britain. Names that meant something to the men who drove them. Today, most of those lorries are gone. The factories are housing estates. The badges are museum pieces. But some drivers still remember exactly what it felt like to climb into one of those cabs at 4 a.m. with a full load and a long road ahead. These are 10 forgotten lorry brands every old driver still talks about. Number 10, Dennis. The Dennis name means fire engines to most people today. But in 1980, the company tried something different. They launched the GV Delta, a 16-ton tipper with a Perkins engine and 5 wheelbase choices. On paper, it looked solid. In real life, the haulage industry did not want it. Dennis had spent decades building specialist vehicles, dustbin lorries, fire tenders, municipal work. The men buying long-haul trucks did not trust a company better known for collecting rubbish than moving freight. Sales came in far too slowly to justify the project. By the mid-1980s, Dennis had quietly walked back to the work it knew best. The GV Delta became one of the shortest stories in British lorry history. What made Dennis different from every other brand on this list is that the company survived by knowing when to quit. It read the room, accepted the loss, and moved on. Most of the names ahead of it did not get that option. They were taken down by recession, foreign buyers, or rust. Dennis just admitted it was in the wrong market and walked away. That is rare. Hold that thought as the brands get bigger, older, and more painful. Number 9, Albion. The Albion name came from Glasgow, and it carried a slogan every Scottish driver knew by heart: sure as the sunrise. Founded in 1899, the company rivaled Foden for toughness and reliability from the First World War all the way into the 1950s. Scottish hauliers were fiercely loyal to Albion. The trucks were built to handle the hard roads that ran through the Scottish Highlands and down through the industrial belt. In 1951, Leyland bought the company. From that point, the Albion range was slowly cut back. By 1972, the name had been quietly removed from most products. In 1980, the badge was dropped entirely, and vehicle production at the old Scotstoun factory ceased. 81 years of Scottish lorry building ended without so much as a press release. Old drivers who had sat in Albion cabs did not forget. The brand was not just a lorry, it was a piece of Scottish industrial pride. When Leyland took that away, there was no ceremony, just a Monday morning, with one fewer name on the grills rolling out of the depot. Sometimes the quietest endings are the ones that hurt the most. Number 8, AEC. AEC stood for the Associated Equipment Company, based in Southall, West London. The brand built some of the most respected commercial vehicles Britain ever produced. The Mammoth Major, the Mandator, the Mercury. These names meant serious, dependable lorries to every transport manager who had to move freight in post-war Britain. During the Second World War, AEC vehicles had carried supplies across 3 continents. The company's reputation was built on decades of earned trust. By the early 1960s, Leyland had taken control. The badge disappeared from lorries in 1977, but the Southall factory kept building Leyland Marathons on the old AEC production lines until May 1979, when the last chassis rolled out and the works closed. Drivers who had started their careers in AEC cabs during the 1960s were still out on the roads as the 1980s began. The engines they had trusted for years were gone, but the memory of them was not. AEC is on this list because the brand walked into the 1980s as a ghost, still rolling in some fleet liveries, still talked about at every motorway services, but the factory was already history. That gap between what drivers remembered and what the industry was becoming tells the story of everything that followed in this decade. Number 7, Atkinson. Ask any veteran haulage driver about the Atkinson Borderer and watch what happens. There is usually a pause, sometimes a slow nod. The Atkinson was built in Preston, Lancashire, and it had a character that older drivers still argue over today. When the company named its range in 1968, every model felt like it meant something. The Borderer was the 2-axle Arctic tractor. The Venturer was the 6x4 heavy unit. The Leader, the Searcher, the Defender. Honest names for honest lorries. In 1970, Seddon Motors from Oldham took over the struggling Atkinson company. The two became Seddon Atkinson. American money from International Harvester came in after that. Slowly, the Atkinson name faded from the cab fronts. But the drivers did not follow the corporate calendar. Tom Riding, a well-known Lancashire haulier who ran Atkinsons for years, never called them Seddon Atkinsons. He called them Atkinsons, full stop, and he was not alone. That loyalty is what put Atkinson on this list. You can buy a company, you can change the badge, but you cannot change what a driver knows about a lorry he has trusted for 20 years. The Atkinson identity outlived the Atkinson nameplate by at least a decade. No buyout in the world can take that away. Number 6. Seddon Atkinson. The Seddon Atkinson 400 series was a serious truck. Gardner engines, Cummins options, Rolls-Royce power going up to 320 horsepower, Fuller gearboxes and Rockwell axles. Operators ran the 400 and the updated logo 401 on cement deliveries, chemical tankers, steel hauls and long-distance work across Britain. For drivers who understood their machinery, the 401 had a lot going for it. Then the rust showed up. The motor panel's cabs corroded badly. Fleet managers started complaining about rotting cab corners and expensive repairs. International Harvester eventually sent engineers from America to investigate, and later models were improved. But the reputation had already taken a serious hit. In 1984, International Harvester sold Seddon Atkinson to Spanish company Enasa. By 1985, the brand held just 5% of the British truck market. The Strato arrived in 1988, a new cab. Better aerodynamics borrowed from the Spanish parent company's Pegaso range. Some drivers appreciated the upgrade, but trust, once lost, is a slow thing to rebuild. The name survived until 2006 when Iveco finally retired it. A brand that once commanded genuine loyalty on British roads ended as a footnote in a European conglomerate's accounts. The rust did not just get the cabs, it got the whole story. Number 5. Leyland T45 road train. In 1980, Leyland launched the T45 road train, and the entire British haulage industry sat up and paid attention. The cab was designed by Ogle Design, the same firm behind some of Britain's most striking concept cars. It was clean, modern and confident. In 1981, the road train won Truck of the Year. The constructor followed for tipper and mixer work. The cruiser and freighter completed the range. For a few years, the T45 was the strongest case British truck manufacturing had ever made against Volvo and Scania. But Leyland was in trouble the entire time. The government was trying to offload the publicly owned company. Budget constraints meant the T45 never got the full high-roof sleeper cab it needed to properly match Volvo's Globetrotter. The road train interstate was the best attempt. Drivers respected it, but they also knew the gap. In 1987, Leyland merged with DAF. The British name began to disappear. Packard took over in 1998. The T45 road train was arguably the last lorry that could honestly call itself a British design from a British company. It won awards. It deserved a better end. And the men who drove it knew that long before anyone in the boardroom was willing to admit it. Number 4. Bedford TM. Bedford was everywhere in the 1970s and early 1980s. Vans, tippers, army trucks, light lorries. If it moved freight in Britain, there was probably a Bedford version of it. The TM was the company's attempt to compete with Volvo and Scania in the heavy, long-distance market. The cab was modern. The design was clean. The ambition was right. The engine killed it. Bedford fitted American Detroit diesel V6 and V8 units, alongside its own 500 turbo and later a Cummins L10 option. British drivers hated the Detroit engines. They revved too high, used too much fuel, and sounded nothing like the slow, heavy Gardner and Cummins units that experienced British lorry drivers had learned to trust. Operators who switched to the Cummins option fared better, but the early damage to the TM's reputation stuck hard. In 1980, Bedford sold 37,000 trucks. trucks. By 1984, that number had fallen to just 14,500. General Motors shut the heavy truck division in 1986. A company that had been building lorries since 1931 was closed by a decision made in Detroit. A WD Trucks briefly continued with some old models, but Bedford was gone, and the absence of that name on the roads felt like something had been taken away quietly in the night with no one given a chance to say goodbye. Number 3. ERF. ERF stands for Edwin Richard Foden. In the early 1930s, the Foden board refused to back diesel lorries. Edwin's son, Dennis Foden, walked out with his father and started a new company in Sandbach, Cheshire. The first ERF ran a Gardner diesel engine. It was built the way its founders believed lorries should be built: simple, honest, durable. And people noticed. By the late 1970s, ERF was producing 4,000 chassis a year. They were one of the last truly independent British truck makers. Then, the early 1980s recession hit hard. By the end of 1983, the Sandbach workforce had been cut from 1,400 workers to just over 600. The factory ran on a 2-day week. A planned assembly plant in Wrexham was abandoned. The fire engineering business was sold off. ERF came back. The C-Series launched in late 1981. The E-Series followed in 1986. The trucks kept selling, though never at the old volumes. What kept ERF alive through all of it was loyalty. Operators who had run ERF for years kept ordering because the trucks did what they were supposed to do, without drama, without fuss. One old driver put it simply: you knew what you were getting, and in the haulage world, that kind of reputation is worth more than any badge on a grill. Number 2. Foden. Foden had been building vehicles in Sandbach, Cheshire since 1856. Steam wagons first, then diesel lorries. The S80 and S83 were fixtures on British roads through the 1970s. Quarry operators, building contractors, and long-distance hauliers all ran them. Foden trucks were fully customizable. You ordered exactly the spec you needed and the factory built it. The company treated its customers like their opinion mattered. In 1980, American company PACCAR bought Foden. PACCAR also owned Kenworth and Peterbilt in the United States. The Sandbach factory was renamed Sandbach Engineering Company. Nearly 2,000 jobs were cut. The business shifted from volume production towards specialist, made-to-order work. In 2006, PACCAR ended production. The last Foden came off the line in Leyland and went straight to the British Commercial Vehicle Museum. 150 years of Sandbach truck building finished on a quiet afternoon. The people who drove Fodens understood exactly what that meant. The people who made the decision probably did not. Number 1. Scammell. No story on this list ends the way Scammell's does. The company had been in Watford since 1921. For over 60 years, it built specialist vehicles nobody else could match. The Crusader was a heavy road tractor respected by hauliers doing the hardest work. The Commander was the British Army's main tank transporter, built to move armour across any terrain without complaint. The S-26 was developed for the Army's DROPS hook loader contract, the most demanding military logistics requirement Britain had placed in a generation. In 1986, Scammell won the tender to supply 1,522 DROPS vehicles to the British Army. For a moment, the Watford factory had a real future. Then, in early 1987, the Leyland Group was sold to DAF of the Netherlands. DAF decided to build the DROPS vehicles at the Leyland plant in Lancashire instead. Watford was marked for closure. In July 1988, the doors shut. The site was sold for housing. DAF sold the rights to several Scammell models to a company called Alvis Uni Power. The Scammell name itself was not included. It simply ended. A factory that had built vehicles through 2 world wars and over 6 decades of hard British industry closed because a foreign company needed to cut overhead. Scammell sits at number 1 on this list because the ending was not a slow decline. It was not rust or falling sales or a failed engine choice. It was a contract won and a factory still closed. A decision made in a Dutch boardroom by people who had never driven a Crusader down. The M1 in January with a full load. For the drivers and workers who knew Watford, that was not a business story, that was personal. And 40 years later, some of them still feel it that way.